So, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the event on From Early Warning to Early Action, Strengthening the Role of Special Procedures in Advancing Atrocity Prevention. My name is Savita Pandey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I would like to first and foremost thank our co-hosts, the permanent missions of Costa Rica, Luxembourg, Sierra Leone, and Switzerland to the UN in Geneva for supporting today's discussion and for their continued commitment to the responsibility to protect. Today's event brings together renowned international experts who will share their perspectives on how special procedures can systematically include what we call an atrocity prevention lens into their work and mandate, and how the multilateral system can enhance the capacities of special procedures to ensure timely and effective action to prevent atrocities. We have approximately an hour for this discussion. Please note that this event is live streaming on our YouTube channel. You can also follow our live tweets on Twitter at GCR2P. If you participate in the discussion, please tag us in your comments. And a recording of the event will be shared on our website and social media channels later today. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our panelists. Ms. Agnes Kalamard. She is the former Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, and arbitrary executions and current Secretary General of the Amnesty International. Mr. Pablo de Greiff, who is the former Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparations, and records. Christine Brocker, who is the Deputy Director of Jacob Institute for the Institute of Human Rights. We are so grateful that all of you can join us, and we are so excited to hear from you. Before we begin, allow me to share a few words on the purpose of today's event. Special procedures mandated by the UN Human Rights Council, including special rapporteurs, independent experts, and working groups, are a central element of the UN human rights system. By reporting, monitoring, and publicly addressing human rights violations and abuses that may escalate to mass atrocities, special procedures play a fundamental role in uphold state responsibility to protect. While we all know that and instances where special rapporteurs successfully mobilized effective action by both countries of concern and the multilateral system to prevent a situation from escalating. Today, we will unpack the role of special procedures in atrocity prevention and how, as diplomats, policymakers, civil society representatives, we can better utilize their work and mandate to strengthen early action for situations at risk and help overcome institutional obstacles that may limit the political impact of special procedures, including questions of capacity and resources, information sharing with UN bodies outside of Geneva, and the way in which HRC creates, renews, and expands the mandate of special rapporteurs. So I will stop there and start the discussion. So my first question is to Pablo and Agnes. So both of your thematic mandates as special rapporteurs have been very closely related to the commission of atrocity crimes, including genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. In addition to using a human rights framework, do you analyze country situation, or did you analyze country situations through an atrocity prevention lens? Agnes, I will go to you first.
Thank you very much, Savita. Unfortunately, the sound was not great. So I wonder whether you could repeat the question. I think I know the question, but if you don't mind repeating it, because you're being a bit hacked when you speak.
No worries. So in addition to using a human rights framework, did you analyze country situations through an atrocity prevention lens, given that both your and Pablo's mandate was very closely related to prevention of atrocity crimes, including crimes against humanity, war crimes.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Savita. Absolutely. Throughout my work as a special rapporteur, I have always suggested that most of the issues I had to focus on and address demanded to have a very integrated and broad legal perspective. In addition to international human rights law, I will rely on a range of other regimes, the first one being international criminal law. I will rely on a range of methodology. I tested out the methodology from a commission of experts and tried to apply it to my work as a special rapporteur. I did that for my investigation into a single crime, that of Jamal Khashoggi, which is not an atrocity crime, but I used the methodology of the COI, including in the way I handled perpetrators, for instance. But if I looked at other crimes, including at country level, so the one that I have in mind in particular are Iraq and Nigeria, in both cases, I definitely went beyond, what human rights had to offer. Why? Because it was a better fit for the reality I had to describe, and because it was a better fit for the recommendations I had to make regarding the severity of the violations and the crimes I had encountered.
Pablo.
Thank you, Savita. I want to start, obviously, by thanking you for the invitation to participate in the event. Now, as to your question, in addition to the considerations that Agnes wisely made, in my case, in a certain sense, I had no option because my mandate was on transitional justice, which is widely understood not to concentrate on isolated events, but rather on the sort of violations that come about through deliberate, systematic policy choices. In other words, what we now call atrocity crimes were part and parcel, the core of the mandate. So yes, it was the natural approach to take. I received some invitations from countries to visit, to examine single isolated events. But of course, I thought, A, they fall out of the mandate, B, there is such a high opportunity cost, given the lack of resources of special procedures, that you want to visit countries where the types of violations that are in question are of a certain nature, of a certain magnitude, of a certain systematicity, and that can also have some sort of spillover effects. Your actions may have some spillover effects. So the isolated violation, as serious as of course it is, particularly from the standpoint of the victim, was not really the remit of the mandate. So the answer is definitely yes.
No, thank you very much for those responses. And Agnes, as you highlighted, the severity as well as the patterns, I think that is such a great entry point in sort of how you consider the application of atrocity crime. And it goes a little bit beyond sort of the human rights framework under which special rapporteurs are supposed to operate. So thank you very much for that. Kristen, now going to you. So while we know about the failures of the international community to act upon early information in cases like Myanmar and Rwanda, could you share with us examples of where the work of the special rapporteurs has contributed to other actors' efforts at prevention and de-escalation?
Yes, thank you so much, Savita. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's such a pleasure to be in the company of esteemed experts, Malmard and Mr. Dupree. A few years ago, my organization, the Jacob Blaustein Institute, published a manual on human rights and the prevention of genocide. And it articulates a set of human rights related risk factors for genocide that we agreed upon in cooperation with past special advisors to the Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. So we have always conceived of human rights monitoring as being particularly important from an atrocity prevention lens when special procedures are documenting, as our previous two speakers said, patterns of serious human rights violations. And in our case, we're focused on those that are directed against a particular group as defined by the Genocide Convention. We've encouraged special procedures to explicitly use prevention language and to signal to audiences in their public communications when they have information suggesting the presence of these risk factors in their work. And that applies to both thematic and to country-specific special procedures. I want to just focus in on one of those risk factors and give a few examples of practice in the last 2 years by special procedures that I think shows a heightened attention to the significance of these kinds of patterns and allows the special procedures to highlight specific cases and specific examples and really give concrete weight to our claims that prevention is necessary in a certain country situation. So the risk factor I'll focus in on is one that we do a lot of work on, and it is related to severe hate speech. The actual term of the risk factor is the widespread or systematic severe dehumanization or demonization of a particular group by state or non-state actors with a view to inciting persecution and violence, and the failure of the state to prevent and punish resulting acts of persecution or violence. So the risk factor tries to capture both the most severe levels of hate speech coupled with either state tolerance, acquiescence, or inaction. In the last 2 years, as I said, there have been important situations where we've seen special procedures flagging concerns about precisely this kind of conduct in ways that are putting other actors on notice that UN mechanisms are attuned to it in a way that we think is very helpful. It's been done in several different methods of work of the special procedures too, both their communications directly to governments, which are at first confidential and then made public after a certain period of time, in press releases, in visits, country visits and reports by special procedures. So I'll give you three. One is the recent focus of the special procedures on the fate of the Ahmadiyya religious minority, particularly in Pakistan, but also in other countries as well. We know that there's a long practice of targeting that community with discriminatory and speech and acts and violence. But we saw 4 special procedures raising specific concerns about these statements in April and May 2020 in communications to the government. And an expression, a direct expression by special procedures, several of them, that they were likely to incite hatred and violence and lead to serious consequences. These statements were made by state officials and they were not being challenged or rejected by the government. The government didn't respond to that communication, and then we saw special procedures issuing an urgent press release, a general statement about rising concerns generally about the persecution of the Ahmadis globally in July of this year. So they followed up on that in a way that's really brought public attention, at least from my community and those watching religious persecution issues. I want to also notice that special rapporteurs repeatedly flagged concerns to the government of Sri Lanka about a wide variety of concerns about repression in that country, including a tolerance of hate speech directed against Muslims and other religious minority communities. We saw it in the report of the visit of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief to Sri Lanka in 2019, a detailed communication to the government by special procedures in April 2020. And then we recently saw an exceptional statement in February 2021 by a group of special procedures that I've never seen anything like it, that really follows up on the whole gamut of prevention-related concerns that special procedures have flagged with that government, and their concerns about failure to implement the recommendations that they've directed over the past few years. And then finally, one more concrete example is a communication by 7 special procedures in October of last year to the government of India about hate speech and incitement to violence against Muslims that were later reflected in public reports by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief in his February 2021 report to Council on Anti-Muslim Hatred Globally. We've seen other great examples. These aren't the only ones of where we are openly talking about concrete threats and specific country situations in a way that illustrates the broader patterns that are giving rise to such concern. We've seen other religious minority communities addressed in statements on global anti-Semitism, on global discrimination and violence against Roma. All of these have been in the last 2 years, and I think that they're extremely helpful to conclude, because the UN system is right now so attuned to the question of hate speech, but the other UN system actors are frequently treating that phenomenon like a naturally occurring phenomenon, not as an act that's directed by individuals, targeting specific individuals in specific places. And the special procedures not only give that kind of concrete detail so that we know what do we actually mean by hate speech, and particularly hate speech that incites violence, gives specificity and clarity, but it also puts the prescribed responses to that hate speech in a human rights framework, which is absolutely critical since governments' responses to hate speech are usually more problematic than even sometimes the original consequences of this dangerous speech. So I'll conclude there, but I could say more in the questions to come.
Thank you so much for that, Kristen. And I'm very glad that you raised this point on how hate speech is now sort of, in the last few years, I think that within the UN system, I've heard this sort of that this is a new phenomena in the world. I mean, and that we didn't see hate speech sort of as a precursor for many, many genocides and crimes against humanity that have happened before. And suddenly, because of social media, there is this new phenomenon of hate speech. So that's a very important point that you're raising. So I'll again go back to Agnes and Pablo. So my question to you is that, so we have talked about how you have included the atrocity prevention lens in your work. So how can the international community better utilize the precise, unique, and action-oriented information produced by the special procedures to ensure timely and effective action to prevent atrocities? Pablo, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Savita. So first, let me make a general comment, if I may. I think that the international community in general, and this includes multilateral institutions, obviously the UN as well. I don't think that we are very, very good at prevention, to be perfectly honest. And part of the reason, I think, is twofold, at least. Obviously, it's much more complex, but I want to refer to 2 factors here. In 2014 and 15, the 3 major reports that the UN commissioned to examine different aspects of the peace-building architecture, the AG HIPPO and the anniversary of Resolution 1325, they all converged on the conclusion that it was important for the UN to broaden and to upstream prevention work. I don't think that this has been followed through with a systematic, substantial work of what broad and upstream the prevention policy might look like. The work of the system and the international community in general continues to be very crisis-oriented. And mind you, of course, I am totally convinced about the importance of crisis prevention, but that is not an example of a broad and upstream prevention work. Anything that is capable of triggering what we now call an early warning system means that there is a lot of work that could have been done upstream that has not been done. And we are now at the moment of crisis trying to prevent the country from falling off a cliff. And that crisis orientation leads to two or three pernicious phenomena from my perspective. First, to an overconcentration on the role of the international community in prevention. And again, this is not an argument against the role of the international community, but what does the effective preventive work in an ongoing basis in country are programs at the national level. One of the consequences of this is that prevention talk in general awakens a lot of suspicions amongst member states about international intervention. And I think that it is very important to demystify prevention in this respect. A good part of prevention, the bulk of it, I would like to say, is done at the national level and not by the international community. The orientation on crisis prevention also means that all the knowledge that we have accumulated over time, which is actually very substantial, about effective prevention policies is not brought to bear in the way that it should, because we are concentrating on very late factors that are usually the responsibility of the international community. So I think that we can do much, much better. That would require what in some of the reports I presented on guarantees of non-recurrence that I called a framework approach. The name is irrelevant. What is important is, of course, a much more systematically thought through policy that takes advantage of policies that we know are effective in the preventive domain, but that are rarely brought to bear in situations in which there are serious threats of human rights violations. And let me illustrate those very briefly with points that are topical right now. We know, for example, that there are policing strategies that are much more likely to lead to violations than others. And there is plenty of empirical evidence about that. You rarely get to discussions about policing strategies in discussing prevention at the United Nations. A more general example, we know that a well-articulated Bill of Rights with an independent constitutional court is a very effective preventive policy. For example, the Colombian Constitutional Court played a crucial preventive role in keeping the negotiations of the peace agreement between extremes of pure politics on the one hand and legal formalism on the other. And were it not for the interventions of the court, I think that the country would have relapsed into conflict, and therefore the idea of prevention would have gone by the wayside. But again, we never think about constitutional courts as preventive tools because we are focusing on the wrong elements. So part of the work that I've been trying to do in the last few years is to think about what a framework for prevention that is broad and upstream would look like. And it turns out, not surprisingly, that it is full of national level initiatives rather than diplomatic good offices or at the extreme peacekeeping operations, neither of which I am criticizing. but the world cannot expect to have an effective preventive policy depend on international interventions. I think that is extremely unwise. So the brief answer to your question is the international community would be much better at prevention if it contributed to the development of a substantive, broad and upstream prevention policy, most of whose elements are national initiatives rather than international initiatives.
Agnes, please go ahead.
Thank you. You know, before identifying maybe the more technical problems, I think there is a political problem, which I will highlight. So, you know, as we've identified in the previous round of questions, special procedures do produce the kind of information that would be helpful for a preventive or a prevention agenda. They may not frame it as such, but I will say almost everything that when I was there, or that they do now as a prevention dimension. But the capacity or the willingness, rather, of political decision-making at international level to even listen to that information, let alone act on it, is rather, well, limited. And the best example is what's happening at the Security Council. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that the Security Council resists using the so-called precise, unique, and action-oriented information that special rapporteurs produce. And therefore, the Security Council willingly fails to benefit from any kind of assessment that special procedures may have done when taking a decision that could involve preventing atrocities. And this problem is not organic to, you know, Security Council procedures. It is an actual determination on the part of some or all members at one point or another to reject special procedures presence or information. So there is an intentional gap, some of which is, or part of it has often been described in the literature as the Geneva-New York gap, but it's a political willingness gap. It's you know, determination on the part of political actors, member states in New York, to avoid bringing in the human rights agenda from the Human Rights Council into their deliberation. And when countries try to bridge the gap, such as Germany or Switzerland or Liechtenstein, when they were on the council, they are accused by various members, beginning with China or Russia, to be working outside their mandate. So there is a real determination to resist formalizing a relationship between the political decision-making of New York and the more technical assessment in Geneva. So I will really begin my answer with that. I think the technical issues we can address at the council, I think, and I can, you know, I identify a few if there is time, but the political one, you know, that's crucial for me. And as long as we don't have either procedures in place, protocol in place, willingness on the part of the member state and the Security Council P5 and so on to take advantage of special procedures, then that won't work. You know, the more technical issue, I don't know if, Savita, I don't know how much time I have. Shall I identify a few things, or is that enough?
No. Yes, please go ahead, Agnes. We have time.
Okay. Right. So then on the technical aspect, which is really silly, but you know, sometimes administrators preventive procedures are used to mask, a political vision. So let's look at the way special procedures can report on a country visit and how long it can take before. Sometimes it's because of the special rapporteur's own doing. Sometimes it's because it is such a cumbersome process. When I was a special rapporteur, we really put a lot of focus on very strong end of mission statement, very long end of mission statement, as a matter of fact, because we knew that it will take so long, and because of the preventive dimension of our mission, it was important to put out strong end of mission statement. But in many occasions, countries are not happy with that. And then the administration is not happy with that either, because it goes against the spirit of, whatever we're supposed to do. But to me, that is, looking at what I was doing personally, I have no doubt that what I found in Nigeria or in Iraq had a very strong preventive dimension. And the fact that, it could only officially be listened to 6 months later, if not in fact 12 months later, really undermined every potential impact, notwithstanding the political willingness, but here the administrative procedures really impeded the potential impact of what we could do. Another thing that the Human Rights Council could do, for instance, is to have special, in their agenda of the session, to have a special discussion on emerging trends. So not just something very formal linked to a country which needs to be adopted by resolution and so on, but to have, as a matter of fact, a session, a discussion on emerging crisis, emerging problems, emerging something that demands a preventive outlook. That, I think, could serve a preventive agenda. We could raise, special procedures could use that to raise alarm around either countries or thematic issue. They have done it, we have done it more in the context of our reporting, and then it becomes, it's not framed as preventative, it's framed as special procedures being accountable to the member state, really, and then having an interactive dialogue which is shrank so much that you can't really have a strong call for prevention. So, there too, it's a lost opportunity. It's possibly driven by administrative reasons. I think that in my opinion, like I said, administration is often a quick way and a cheap way to hide, lack of will and a different political agenda.
Savita,
Yes,
may I add one note to Agnes's comment?
absolutely.
Because in my experience, Agnes, the special procedures themselves, I think, can become much more adept at using an explicitly preventive lens. So this, in fact, in the system as a whole, depends a lot on individuals. So you did it without a doubt, and there are others that have done it. I, in a certain sense, had no choice. So this is not self-praise. My mandate included guarantees of non-recurrence, so a forward-looking thing. But on the whole, I think that it is fair to say that whether particular mandates adopt a preventive lens or not depends on the individual mandate holder. That there is still, both in the Council in general and even within the special procedures, the general idea that everything that is done in the domain of human rights is preventive. But I think that there is a huge difference between prevention as a side effect of work in human rights and preventive as a deliberately chosen strategy. And one very easy way of seeing this is, for example, in the fight against impunity. Are you recommending the prosecution, the investigation and prosecution of cases more or less at random? Or, for example, are you using the dismantlement of organized crimes and centers of potential human rights violations as a criterion for investigation and prosecution? One of them is much more useful for preventive purposes than the others. And I don't think that the special procedures as a whole have a great deal of clarity about the distinction between prevention as a side effect and prevention as an explicit strategy. And I think that this has to be acknowledged.
Yeah,
if we
I
want
agree,
to...
Pablo. I fully agree. In fact, when one of the recommendation I had done as a special rapporteur was to establish a task force focusing on prevention. You know, so that 3, 4, 5 special procedures will go together on a given country, or you know, do something with a committed preventive agenda. There was a lot of interest amongst my colleagues to do so, and then COVID hit us. So we were planning a mission, in fact, 4 of us, and then COVID hit, and then I left. I'm hoping that my colleagues are, because there was so much interest around it, I hope it's going to be picked up and followed up. I fully agree with you. There is not, you know, we don't really have a proper preventive framework in the way we work and present the work. And yeah, I agree.
So thank you so much for that. I mean, you know, generally within these kinds of forums, you're not able to have a conversation. So Pablo and Agnes, you have outdone yourself and actually had a back and forth on this. So thank you so much for highlighting how we can think about prevention for special rapporteurs, both in terms of the political space as well as the administrative place. And Pablo, I really appreciate the way you talked about sort of the role that national institutions can play, because you're absolutely right. Within the international system, we talk a lot about prevention, but our understanding of what the national institutions can do is still very limited. So that's fantastic. Kristen, coming to you, and it's a follow-up to what both Pablo and Agnes talked about in terms of sort of the political obstacles. So the UN's siloed approach often inhibits information sharing, coordination and exchange between the HRC, the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council. So how can the work of special procedures be more systematically integrated within the peace and security agenda? And what can be done to ensure greater information sharing? I mean, Agnes pointed out a little, like, answer this partially, between New York and Geneva and bridge the gap.
Thank you. I mean, that's a perennial challenge that obviously we've all just touched upon. It's been going on for a long time, and there have been what look like dedicated attempts to correct or bridge the Geneva-New York divide for many years, none of which has been satisfactory. Frankly, we're at a time where even modest gains that we've made in the past are fragile and need to be preserved. So, you know, I can point to positive practices that I think that if we collected, member states could really take more, especially in a group of friends type setting, could take a much more focused look at trying to replicate across more country contexts. And to take one step back, I think we need to be clear-eyed about the degree to which we can formally achieve institutionalization of a lot of these practices just because of the political realities at the Human Rights Council and at New York that our other speakers already kind of flagged. This is necessarily an informal and ad hoc effort by states and by, particularly that needs to be led by states, to show and to communicate both to special procedures and to other governments that they really value this work by special procedures, that they want to see them engage in it, and frankly, that they will not only encourage special procedures who frame their work in a preventive lens, who engage in that kind of early warning and clear signaling activity with a focus on correcting a situation before it escalates into something worse. Not only will they encourage that and reward those special procedures who are trying to do it by amplifying their voices, but they'll also defend them. We should never have a situation where a special procedure is trying to raise preventive information to the Human Rights Council or to another entity and is publicly shamed or criticized by diplomats for doing so without an immediate response from governments that support that work. I think there is a big risk of creating. Hear me? Sorry, I heard something. Can you hear me?
Kristen, you're breaking up a lot.
Oh, can you hear me if I do this?
Sorry, you're breaking
better?
up a lot.
How about?
Yes, this is better.
Is this better? If it's not, I'll turn my video off. Yeah. Okay. So just
No,
wanted
this is better. This is better. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, just to summarize the point I was trying to make and breaking up while doing, we need to see vigorous defense of the special procedures who exercise the capacities that the council has given them, because there is an attempt to chill that behavior on the part of special procedures that some states actively engage in, and that can be very harmful to the overall enterprise because it can create a degree of caution that's not only unwarranted, but that really eviscerates the core value of the special procedures to the system, which is their capacity to independently gather information. So what can member states do to bridge the gap between Geneva and New York specifically? Well, we can collect examples of what's working and apply it to other country and issue situations. We've seen special rapporteurs briefing member states in ARIA formula meetings of the Security Council, but it certainly hasn't been done systematically. I can count several special procedures on country-specific and other situations who have used atrocity prevention language very recently and who have not been invited to brief member states in that kind of a setting. Similarly, states can take other less formal steps than convening an ARIA formula meeting to mobilize special procedures and have them providing information to other colleagues in New York and in that kind of a diplomatic setting. I mean, the advent of virtual meetings being something we do all the time should, create that kind of incentive. More importantly, there are special procedures who are specifically encouraged by the Human Rights Council to come to New York and to present information to the third committee. This is an opportunity to go far beyond that. We had special procedures who were present in New York, even though they were presenting virtually to the committee a month or two ago. And I'm not sure that states here and diplomats here took a full advantage of the opportunity that they had to meet in person if they wanted to, or virtually with those special procedures, and really kind of dig into the prevention aspects of what they're working on and the communications and the press statements and other things they've been doing in the absence of country visits during COVID. Let's see, I had a couple other ideas. I mean, I think that Agnes's proposal to have a task force is incredibly important, and it bears exploring how that could be done, if not formally. Formally would be the ideal, but the problem obviously is the political impediments to creating that kind of action through the Human Rights Council or otherwise. We could institutionalize what the Security Council used to refer to as horizon scanning meetings. There could be a group of present or former special procedures who together kind of engage in that kind of information collection activity with the support of key member states in an informal setting on a regular basis. All it takes is one state to suggest that. And here in New York, the government of, I believe it's Finland, right, for almost 20 years has been having retreats with incoming non-permanent members of the Security Council to bring them on board as they're coming online. It's going to help them anticipate challenges that they will experience when they join the Security Council and to get them on the right foot. We could conceive of a system like that for incoming special procedures mandate holders, for newly onboarded ones, with the support of states, with non-governmental organizations in that kind of a holistic setting, where we incentivize that kind of strategic thinking and deliberate approach to the exercise of their mandate that would be so helpful, and that I don't think that special procedures currently receive that sort of institutional support from the system to do it. And if I can make one last point, you had asked about the UN system and facilitating a greater contribution there. There's still huge coordination problems within the UN system. Some of it, reflects lack of interest in the special procedures work, but not all of it. Some of it is simply just lack of capacity and time to carry out that kind of coordination. What we see is that when the Secretary General makes this sort of collaboration a priority, it tends to happen. And so I would encourage states to encourage the Secretary General, that as he's trying to implement and take forward some of his sweeping visions, like in the Our Common Agenda report, in a call to action for human rights, where he's put forward this messaging about wanting to have an integrated UN response.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. How about I do this? Totally not better. How about this? Can you hear me better now? At all? Any better? Okay, you're muted,
this is
so
better,
but
yeah.
You can hear me. Great. My last thought is that we saw a really good practice over the course of the pandemic of the Special Advisor's Office on Genocide Prevention, of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Alliance of Civilizations, and key special procedures, and faith-based organizations and actors coming together in a series of seminars to talk about challenges like hate speech in the context of COVID, and thinking through best practices and responses to those kind of phenomena that were protective of religious minorities. It was a specific request from the Secretary General to have that kind of a coordinated thought exercise take place. It resulted in the publication of a report. The seminar series is over now, but it's the kind of practice that could absolutely be institutionalized and could be if it was made a priority. So that's all I had to add. Sorry for the sound quality.
So much, Kristen. So my next question, and this is such a great discussion because you can mine so many good practices from what all of you have said, and I wish that we can come up with sort of a written and we will put something together, because this is really useful in terms of sort of communicating to states and policymakers what are the different ways in which we can overcome some of the institutional impediments. So my next question now is to, and I think that this may be our final question, to both Agnes and Pablo, that how can we think, how can the special procedures, thematic ones and country-specific, work together to sort of provide better, I think that more sort of proximate prevention, early warning in emerging situations. So we have talked about prevention, but in the case of Ethiopia last week, we saw special procedures coming together and releasing a statement. So in your sort of practice, in the way that you worked, what were some of the best practices where you were able to work as thematic procedure holders with people who worked on country-specific situations? Pablo, you want to go ahead, or Agnes?
Well, I'm just jumping. I mean, yeah, I did see the question in the chat room. I'm not sure there is a problem of them not working together. I'm not sure what is the question hinting to. In my experience, country specific mandate holders may or may not work with thematic mandate holders, and it is only because of their personal inclination. There is nothing really in the way we work, in the politics, in the administration that do prevent it. I think some mandate holders at country level see their read their mandate in a certain way and will rather not involve thematic mandate holders, and others do. So, for instance, the mandate holders on OTP, on the occupied territories, very, very frequently will work with thematic mandate holders. I've worked with country mandate holders on and off on Mali, for instance. But it's gonna on Central African Republic. But it is gonna be very, very much driven by the country mandate holders. This is not about thematic mandate holders don't really have are not in a driver's seat there. They can approach a country mandate holder, they can make suggestions, but it will be up to them to determine what will work best for the environment that they know best. It will be up to them to determine whether that kind of intervention will bring about the desired impact or could make their work far more difficult or complex. So I think, I don't know what Pablo thinks, but I don't feel that it is necessarily something that needs, a great deal of investment. And in any case, country mandate holders have a mandate. They often report from a prevention standpoint on existing or future atrocity crimes, and they don't need us to be taken seriously and for their work to receive the attention it deserves, even though it's always helpful to work collectively.
I agree with Agnes. In my experience, so I agree with Agnes. In my experience, there was in fact a great deal of interaction between my thematic mandate and country-specific mandates. Not with all of them, but with a good number of them. So Agnes is right. This also depends on personal preferences and predispositions. I think that the great obstacle there, the great practical obstacle there, is the geographic dispersion of the mandates and the fact that we are not all together in the same place and the fact that everyone has a full-time job. But within those constraints, frankly, I do not think that this is the most urgent problem to need, and that when the need arises and there is the will, in fact, all those obstacles are overcome and coordinated work is achieved. I worry much more about the other 2 points that we were discussing before. First, a lack of understanding, of real deep understanding of the difference between general human rights work on the one hand and specifically preventive work on the other. And secondly, the lack of a comprehensive preventive policy that would mitigate some of the reservations by member states about international intervention, because the comprehensive policy would highlight the fact that the bulk of prevention happens at the national level and that this can be supported by the international community without any threat to their national sovereignty, and by the way, to much greater efficacy than anything that we can do alternatively. So I would put the emphasis there much more than on the coordination of mandate holders.
Thank you so much for that. And Kristen, just a very final question for you. I think that this is we're coming up on the hour. So Jacob Blaustein has worked extensively on the prevention of atrocity crimes and also in promoting the work of special procedures. In your opinion, how can the atrocity prevention lens be better institutionalized in the work of special procedures?
Well, I think just to kind of build off of some of the points I was making earlier, there already is a great deal of institutionalization taking place that's helpful. I mean, it's been really good to see the council articulating both like reaffirming the normative framework of R2P, but also speaking about prevention, commissioning the study that Pablo was involved in on what prevention actually means, provoking that kind of a thought exercise. Those have been helpful contributions. Many of the mandates of the special procedures flag prevention. To the degree that we can keep doing that and expanding on that practice, that's a helpful signaling device. But I think the risk of trying to do too much to institutionalize this risks opening a can of worms that we don't need or want to open, because the special procedures have what they need, which is independence. The most critical thing, the most important aspect of their work is their ability to operate outside the constraints that the rest of the UN system, the political constraints that other UN system actors are constantly facing and trying to navigate. And the other value added, there are many, of special procedures, in addition to their expertise, is their ability to coordinate with civil society, their ability to develop networks that are deep and broad with civil society and grassroots actors, and really explore these situations from the perspective of rights holders, and to translate that into information back to the council that it needs to hear. Now, Pablo referenced one aspect that does impede this, and that is the fact that they have full-time jobs, that they are not paid employees, that they have low resource capacity. There's only so much that member states can do to enhance the support that special procedures receive from the system. I'm all too aware of what the budget dynamics are that result in the under-resourcing of the special procedures system. That being said, it can't be something that member states let go. They have to clearly look at what it is they expect special procedures to take on, which is limitless, right? And to do it well is beyond limitless, because it involves cooperating, coordinating with, examining, becoming so deeply familiar with the ins and outs of so many different country contexts, if you really take it to the extreme and to do it as comprehensively as it should be done. So not inhibiting special procedures from drawing on all the resources that they possibly can to get this work done and to bring us all together in supporting this mission, I think, is another important thing that member states need to do, and to see that as part of the institutionalization. It's protecting the institutional capacity of the special procedures as much as anything else.
Thank you very much for that. Pablo and Agnes, do you have any final points that you want to make based on what Kristen just said in terms of capacities for special procedures and sort of the institutional opportunity?
She got it. She got it, yeah. I just wanted to react to one issue on the chat room, which I thought was really interesting, on what's happening in so-called democratic countries. And why is it that we don't use the preventive framework, the crisis preventive framework, to emerging scenarios in democracies around incitement to hatred, dehumanization, targeted attacks? You know, you don't need to have for a preventive agenda, you do not need to have massacres to take place, which could be the first step towards more massacres. I think we are in pretty awful scenario right now in many so-called democracies around the world, characterized by, you know, mass spread dehumanization of refugees, of of Muslims or other groups, and there is no massacres. But maybe that's why we need to intervene now and to really use a preventative framework, which of course is not the one that we have in mind when we think of it. But I will strongly recommend that we do so right now, because the situation is so catastrophic. From an historical standpoint, it is so catastrophic that it reminds me of what I had read regarding the 1930s for Europe, at least, that I really hope we can apply a preventative framework to what's happening in many so-called democracies, because we've got to prevent the worst before it happens. Thank you.
And I could not agree with Agnes more. And in fact, the numbers, for example, of racially motivated attacks, attacks motivated by factors such as sexual orientation, all sorts of divisive factors. I mean, it's already suggesting, those numbers already suggest that something terrible is happening. So Agnes is completely right. We cannot take it for granted that the simple label democracy is a guarantee that works at this point. Horrible things are taking place in democracies.
Thank you very much. We are on the hour now. And a very, very warm thank you to Pablo, Agnes, and Christine for taking time away from your very, very busy schedules to come and join us and have this conversation. We want to continue to have similar conversations, and we will be in touch. And again, a warm thank you to our co-hosts, the permanent missions of Costa Rica, Luxembourg, Sierra Leone, and Switzerland. A recording of this event will be available on our website and through our social media. So, you know, for those who have missed it, can watch it later, or were not able to watch it fully, can watch it later. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and an honor to be with Christine.